Hello, everyone, and welcome to our USGS public lecture for this evening. Thank you for joining us for our first lecture of 2022 at our new start time of 6 p.m. Pacific. We're hoping this will give our Central and Eastern States folks a little bit of a better opportunity to join us live. My name is Christy Ryan, and I will be your host and moderator today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to make a few announcements and maybe give others out there in virtual land a few extra minutes to get settled and logged in. First, I wanted to give you a heads up about our lecture for next month. On February 24th, we will have research geologist Zeno Levy as our guest speaker. Zeno is with our California Water Science Center, and the title of his lecture is Do Droughts Affect Groundwater Quality? A California Story. So be sure to save the date and join us next month as well. At the end of the lecture, I will provide information on how to join our mailing list, so you'll always be in the know on our future lectures. Next up, we wanted to just take a second and give you some tips on a few features on this Teams platform. If you're watching on a desktop computer and you need to turn on the closed captioning, just look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen for the closed caption icon, the one with the 2 C's. Another feature we wanted to direct your attention to is the question and answer panel. That can be opened by clicking the question mark icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. At the end of the lecture, we will have a Q&A session with the speaker, so this is where you can submit your questions. And just please understand, we may not have time to answer all the questions we get, but we're going to do our best, and we appreciate your understanding about that. So now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and introduce our speaker for this evening. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Thomas Edwards. Dr. Edwards received his bachelor's degree in wildlife management from Humboldt State University, his master's degree in ecology from the University of New Mexico, and his PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Florida. He recently retired from his position as a research ecologist and assistant leader with the USGS Utah Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit after over 33 years as a federal research scientist. He is currently Professor Emeritus in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University. Dr. Edwards' research interests centered on landscape scale conservation planning and the development of methods for assessing and monitoring biological diversity at landscape scales. Past efforts included design and analysis strategies for inventorying and modeling rare ecological events in time and space, with specific emphasis on rare listed plant distribution models and energy development in the U.S. Intermountain West. He currently teaches 2 National Conservation Training Center courses on data management and manipulation using R, and species distribution and habitat modeling. Now being retired and teaching these 2 courses leaves a lot more time for his first grandbaby, which he is very, very happy about. So without any further ado, let's all give a warm virtual welcome to Tom. And Tom, the floor is all yours.
Okay, welcome everybody. Let me go ahead and share the screen out following the procedures here, and we'll go ahead and get bear with me for a second while I do a few little changes to things here to get going, and allow me to turn on my little highlighter over here, because sometimes I like to, oh, come on, show me the color, please. There we go. Okay, so welcome. I apologize for taking advantage of the Beatles song here, which here, there, and everywhere, because in part, that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about tonight, which is the fact that species are here, they're there, and species are just about everywhere. Which kind of leads to this fundamental question of why species live where they do. And as Christy mentioned, I just recently retired from the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm currently Professor Emeritus at Utah State University. And she mentioned some of the research areas that I had worked in previously. Some of these do with climate-induced distribution shifts in conifers. She mentioned the rare plant distributions and energy development in the Intermountain West. as well as some of these change impacts on ungulate migration patterns in the Intermountain West. And as you can see over there, there's just way too many dogs in my life and not yet enough grandbabies, but they're coming. So, of course, it's always fun to start out where these talks will be going. And tonight, I'm going to try to make this a bit more fun than one of these kind of just staid, somewhat static things about how we build maps. But I love maps. And you'll see in a minute some examples. I've just always been fascinated by it. But before we get into maps dealing with the distribution of species and their habitats, it's kind of fun to explore how we came about to the state that we're at today in terms of some of the tools and resultant outcomes of those tools that allow us to basically predict where organisms and associated habitats might be found on landscapes. And then that flows right on into how we use these types of distributions in today's world of conservation and management. So we, and especially me, love maps. And basically, that's what we're doing when we build distribution products. But historically, the maps we have used, they're kind of graphical representations of spatial relationships among elements in a landscape. And of course, man has, capital M, man has a huge, astonishing history. Many of our earliest maps were for navigation. And so here, for example, is fathom designations off of Maui Island. Lots of these types of things. This was back in the era when a scale on a map was based on the width of the nib of the pen that actually created the maps, not in the same sense we use scale today. Here's an example of the navigation in Boston, and you can kind of see how Boston Harbor had built up over time, because this is the original Boston, the infamous neck that's often mentioned in our American Revolutionary War and the Boston Neck. So you can kind of see the history of the actual Boston Harbor and its highlines, and how over time we built all these shipping slips out here on these maps to do this. Many of you may have actually seen this Menard's 1869 map, and this is actually universally considered to be the greatest informative map ever built. This width right here is a measure of the size of Napoleon's army when it set out for Moscow. And of course, if you participated in that map, or that march, you had a very, very slim likelihood of returning alive. The other part about it is down here along this particular x-axis down here, Menard placed in temperatures, changes in elevation, and things like this. And so you can kind of see how informative things like this, because in an instant, you can grasp what's going on. And of course, that's why we so use these maps when we're looking at distributions. And even then, this is a photo from a book here that shows some of the earliest types of maps in terms of the distributions of organisms. So we have a rich, rich history of pulling these things together. And now by the time we get into today's environment, particularly with the advent of geographic information systems, these types of maps, and you'll hear me refer to them as map products sometimes like this, these types of things are central to ecology and the conservation and management of our nations, if not world species. So you can see things like elevation, annual temperatures, seasonality of precipitation, and all of these types of map products are central to aiding us develop distribution representations for use in conservation and management. Well, as I mentioned before, I find the history of this is important. And in some sense, in terms of scientific philosophy that I certainly abide by through my career and even now, you can't really understand what you're doing today unless you are aware of the historical antecedents. And so it's kind of fun then if we consider this whole concept of distribution and habitat modeling. Where did some of these efforts arise? I mean, what's kind of the logical progression of scientific thought that has led to this concept of distribution and habitat modeling? Well, believe it or not, Aristotle's work, when he wrote about, I think it was 9 essays on what we can generically call zoology or biology, one of these was titled Essence and Habitat. And it's one of the earliest known discourses on the relations of animals to habitats. Now, he spoke a lot of different types of species, but one of the ones I like to note when I discuss this is in referring to fish. He noted that movement into estuaries occurs for 2 purposes, food and breeding. So right off the bat, he was noticing, he was observing that fish are moving across a landscape, in this particular case from ocean waters on into estuaries, and yet that movement was being driven by 2 very important life history characteristics. They need food and they need locations to breed for their young to be reared. Now, while Aristotle, at least when you read some of the histories that go along with these types of essays, he never posed the question why species do this. But nonetheless, I mean, he's credited with being the first one to put together what we would phrase an empirical or an observation-based approach to species, or excuse me, to science. But it was these observations that set the stage for later quests to understand why the observed relationship occurred. So why are they moving into the estuaries? Well, it's easy to say food, but what type of food? When is the food best available? Is that available food best available? Is breeding then, the breeding period, a consequence of that available food? So you can start to see how a whole multitude of questions could be derived from these observations. Hence, this is part of the reason he's given credit for first bringing this up. Now, strangely enough, for a whole host of historical reasons, certainly in what we would define as Western Europe, very strangely enough, very little curiosity existed about animals and habitats, for the 1700 or so years after Aristotle's death. But eventually, by the time we got into the 17th and 18th centuries, sometimes this is referred to as the age of Enlightenment right in here. There was this regrowth, this birth, a renaissance of looking at hosts of ecological issues. I mean, certainly Charles Darwin used observations of distributions to support his theory of evolution by natural selection. If we go even further and look at some other ecologists from this time period, von Humboldt and Miriam right here, they noted changes in plants and animal species over a gradient. This is one of the maps right here. So you can kind of see down here, deciduous type trees, we get more into coniferous, we get on into scree, kind of like there at the, and then we get above timberline where we're up into rock and very limited likelihoods. I'm sure many of you, out in Intermountain West of North America, the Sierras, the Cascades, the Rockies, you can see these types of very distinct zonal patterns. And so these types of observations were leading people to try to understand why were conifers in this zone and deciduous trees inside here. And this kind of renaissance in this period right here on these relationships began to set the stage for understanding species distributions. Let's talk about a couple of people who were really, really important in this area. One of the principals, Joseph Grinnell, an American zoologist, set up the Berkeley Museum of Natural History right here. One of the things that he developed here was this concept of something that is called the niche. And you can see the definition. It's the sum of the habitat requirements and behaviors that allow a species to persist and produce offspring. He did this work on the California thrasher over here in basically central and northern California right here. Now, the really fascinating breakthrough he came up with was that his concept right here provided a fundamental basis for determining where a species might be found. He first brought in this idea that there's things we can refer to as abiotic environmental elements out there, things like temperature and precipitation. And at the same time, there's biotic variables out there. For example, reliance on mast from oaks in Central California as a food source and things like this. So he brought these two concepts together, and from that derived what we refer to as ecological partitioning. And this is this idea where a species partition out subsets of this range of abiotic and biotic characteristics that meet their habitat requirements so they can successfully survive and reproduce. So I'm hoping you can start to see here now that you can see how if we can understand what this niche is and how it's partitioned, it can help us begin to build distributions of species. It's not too different from that question I posed earlier. Why are conifers found at this particular zonal component in an elevational gradient? Because they're partitioning some elements of the biotic and abiotic resources out. Well, this same concept can apply to organisms such as birds. A second very important development in this time period here was Charles Elton, and he was a British ecologist at Oxford. And he kind of modified this concept of a Grinnellian niche here to focus on a species' relations to its food and its enemies. The slight distinction he made is rather than just focusing on the partitioning of these abiotic and biotic elements, he also included foraging behaviors and habitats. Now, it's often funny that when we see an organism and we see enemies, we tend to think of a predator, say, preying on an herbivore, carnivore on an herbivore. But Elton was a bit more broad-based in his perspective, and a grazer is and if I can phrase it this way, the enemy of a plant as well. And so this brings into focus how we can start to use these types of relations to enhance distributions. But he also brought up a very fundamental component right here, and that's this idea that species not only respond to these environmental elements and hence have their distributions defined, but they alter these environments as well, which led to this concept of food webs and how distributions of species can change based on alterations of the environment, not only by themselves, but by other species. He's kind of considered the founding father of this whole concept here of the food web. Remember this? I'm sure most of us got this in like 4th or 5th grade. Big bunch down here: And in terms of this food pyramid, you had to have a lot more herbivores for the top carnivores to make it in a system. So by now, we're starting to advance this concept of niche to not only use the relationships to the environment, but we can include other species as well. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the changes that have occurred in the Yellowstone ecosystem since wolves were reintroduced. In terms of how that changed the foraging pattern of many of the ungulates, and consequently how they impacted the herbaceous material up there. Willows is an example frequently used up there, which in turn changed the distributions of a host of animals. So now we've got this cool concept of niche. We've got this idea of food webs and how organisms themselves can alter their environment or have their environment altered by others. Kind of one of the last pieces of the puzzle here is Evelyn Hutchison, a British ecologist from Yale, and he again expanded on this, taking advantage of some of the advances from Grinnell and those by Elton, and referred to something as an n-dimensional hypervolume. So what he's saying is that we have this hypervolume out here. Typically, if you're lucky, you can visualize 3 dimensions, but think 2 dimensions here right now. That inside there you might have a resource along the x-axis and a resource along the y-axis. And inside there, an organism is going to find a subset along the x and a subset along the y. We'll see some examples of that here in a minute. But like him before, he emphasized these roles of abiotic and biotic elements, lights, nutrients, and the subsets. He's best known, however, for his rather amusing query, which is, why are there so many organisms found in a habitat? And so from this, he spoke of what he called the niche breadth, which is the subset from a range that's occupied by a species. So now, by just kind of each one of these advances taking advantage of previous work, we've reached a point now where if we can determine this niche breadth for an organism, we can actually begin to model where a species might be found. Now, the final stage here is work by Robert MacArthur and Robert Levins, and they were 2 of the first ecologists in the mid to late 50s who applied, or excuse me, early 60s, who applied simple statistics to the niche, and they called it utilization. So what happens here is a species divides the resource, that's the x-axis, and notice they can either have narrow, I'll focus on the green one here, or broad subsets of the particular resource here. And that in turn defines the utilization of what they are able to do. With certainly these peaks, if you move that on down to the x-axis right here, representing what might call the optimal conditions in that resource where the organism is best suited to live. Now, absent any competition, that means there's no other species out there fighting for these same resources with you. They define what you call a fundamental or unconstrained niche. If you've got competition, it's a realized and a constrained. So we've got pieces of the puzzle now. What I want you to do is look at this distribution right here. Notice it kind of goes on up, and I've just portrayed something simple here as the normal distribution. So if we were to go out into the environment right here and sample all of the possible responses. Let's for right now consider this maximum temperature out in an environment. To do this, we might see a distribution that looks something like that. So now, however, we've got this niche breadth, this realization, this smaller subset that the organism is found in. That relates back to these depictions up here. So by going ahead and knowing where these bounds are right here, we now are capable of modeling, because we have this background of all of the maximum temperature range right here. Now all we need to do is figure out a way to take this distribution and map this on into a spatial model, and then we can begin to build these spatial predictions. So that leads then to these kind of next couple of questions here. So how did these historical foundations now set the stage for what I refer to as today's modeling of distributions and habitats? And what kind of statistical and analytical tools are used to build these? Well, this is what we do nowadays. This acronym right here, I ran out of space, that just stands for Species Distribution and Habitat Model process. What we do to generate these models nowadays is we tend to survey for the thing we're interested in. This could be a bird nest. This could be a den, a burrowing den. This could be the presence or absence of a particular plant species, a non-vascular plant like lichen or something. And what we do inside our geographic information systems and our XY space here is we notice where things are found. All the little X's that I'm going ahead here and covering. This might represent where we find something. And certainly with today's GIS, any of us can buy one of these at the store nowadays. You can get a precise XY in whatever coordinate reference systems you want. So the next thing we do is we take those responses, presences and absences, the black dots up here represent absence. Now we go on into a geographic information system where we have environmental predictors. Remember those maps I showed at the beginning that had the precipitation and the elevation and the seasonality and things like that? Well, these are all information layers, and you take an X right here and you punch it on through inside our computers, inside the GIS system, and from that you extract the value of temperature or rainfall or whatever these are like this for the presence absence, and then we put it into a statistical model. Now inside this model we ascertain the relationships. Are the presence of the tree species, just to pick an example, or is the presence of the tree species related to more or less rain? Something as simple as that. From that, we end up with a spatial depiction of probabilities. In this location, the lighter gray, about a 0.2 likelihood of that species being found. The middle one here, 0.6, and the darker one, 0.8. That in turn allows for inference as to where a species may or may not be found in a landscape. Well, and of course, in the field of science, we like to have defensible models, and so we end up kind of doing this loop process right here. We build the model, we assess, and sometimes we actually have to go back and recalibrate. So even though I'm showing these as a kind of a sequential steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's actually opportunity to go back and forth when you do these things. Now, One of the important things to note here is that this process relies on statistical modeling. And that itself is not without its own pitfalls. So as you're building these things, it's kind of nice to be aware of where you can be tripped up. These things are not like the historic Rand McNally map you used to have that if it said it was 7 miles from town 1 to town 2, you could usually rely on that to be right. Now, there's some important little caveats that are associated with these types of things. Since we're in a modeling world, there's a very important caveat here by a very famous statistician named George Box. All models are wrong. Some are useful. Now, the wrong component here tends to mean there's no such concept as a best model, or specifically, no such concept as a best distribution or habitat model. The thing we're searching for up here is something that is useful in the conservation and management arenas, at least people like myself operate in. Now there's a second one. Many of you have probably heard this. There's 3 kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, I already told you that a lot of this stuff is statistical modeling, so you can see what I'm referring to here. And this is because one of the shortcomings of ecologists, and I cheerfully place myself in this group, is we sometimes overemphasize these statistics to the exclusion of the biology and natural history of these organisms, and that can be dangerous. Of course, my favorite, I'm a Douglas Adams fan from way back when, after 7.5 million years of, I inserted it right here, statistical analysis, the answer to the meaning of life came back, and if you're at all familiar, it's 42, pointing out that sometimes the answers we get from these types of things may not always be realistic, even though we think we spent a tremendous amount of time building these things. Now, I point these caveats out all the time when I'm introducing these types of models on into the world of conservation and management, just to point out that these are tools to help us make decisions. These are not prescriptions that prescribe how management should occur. So given some of that introduction right here, let's look at what some of these distribution and habitat model examples look like and how they are often applied to resolving today's conservation and management issues. So, invasive species. I'm sure many of you have heard about invasive species and the often negative impacts they are having on many of our landscapes. This one is a common mullen up here in Lava Beds National Park in Northern California. And the particular thing I want you to note about here, this is what they call a classification tree. It's one of these nebulous statistical models. But I want you to notice this particular variable, distance to road, this one, and trails and things like this. We also have some variables here that are environmental, precipitation, soil, temperature, humidity, and things like that. Now, as a manager, I cannot manage the ones that are in this darker green. But this distance to roads and things like this, and you can see the red area right here, and in retrospect, I realized I should have overlaid the roads, but this follows the roads and the trail system inside Lava National Beds National Park. Now, the reason is because each summer, the National Park Service hires a bunch of technicians. They put Roundup on the back and in backpacks they carry, and they go out to try to get rid of this species. So this is a case where these types of models can be used to help us manage something like an invasive species. Well, here's one of my favorite critters, the northern goshawk over here, and this is a bird species of concern. This right here is a distribution habitat model specifically focusing on nesting habitat in the Intermountain West. You can kind of see state of Utah out here. This is what we call the Wasatch Uinta Range. And all of this red area up here, inside here, represents, and I want to make sure you understand, potential, not necessarily actual, but potential nesting habitat. Now, how does this work? How does this help management? Well, we kind of have a depiction of where these nests might be found. And so what this means then is when the Forest Service is thinking about a particular timber harvest regime or something like that, this then can aid them in the sense of where they might wish to place these harvest regimes. This is an endangered species Section 7 regulatory example. There's a cactus right here called the Hookless Cactus. Absolutely gorgeous cactus when it's flowering out here. And this is our Colorado Plateau of the Intermountain West right here. That little red spot right up there is this. This is a proposed energy leasing. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Services requires what they call pre-management surveys in many cases, where there's a known likelihood of a listed species being there. And these darker colors right here, which aren't even showing up when I put my map over it, indicate areas where a whole bunch of models. So we did a whole bunch of models right here. High likelihood that the cactus is going to be found here. These lighter colored areas indicate lower likelihoods. So in terms of efficient field sampling, yes, the Fish and Wildlife Service could and did correctly require the leasee to go out and do very heavy sampling there and less heavy sampling on up in here to determine whether or not the proposed wellheads they were going to place in there could negatively impact this particular cactus right here. So again, here's an example of how these things are used in a regulatory environment. Now, we all know about climate change nowadays, and there's a lot of these types of models that fall under a category called spatial forecasting. Aspen. I mean, living out here in Intermountain West, I mean, this is the iconic tree species of the Intermountain West. I mean, and I'm right about down in this area here and in my Utah, and look what the projection is by the end of this century in terms of the species distribution. Now, you got to remember what this is built on. Remember, I showed you that distribution that went like this, and there was the smaller distribution inside there where the species was found. Well, what's happening now is through climate shift, this distribution here in the future will look something like this, meaning the aspen has a much smaller possible area given its current life history requirements for it to live. Consequently, we will see some of these types of changes to do this. One of my last models right here is an abundance model. These things can be used. This is a Lycan, Lobaria oregano. It's circumpolar. It is used as an indicator of air pollution, because its cellular structure can take up air or particles in the air and incorporate it on into the structure. And there was a lot of concern in the Pacific Northwest that these might be disappearing. And so what you can actually do is use these same types of models to not only show the pace, the spatial representation, but kind of a trend estimate, how some of this might be changing over time. So with that, those are some of the ways these types of models are used in today's environment. Now, we still have concerns regarding the application, and many times these concerns fall into a category in management and conservation that's referred to as decision risk. which is the potential adverse impact of a decision when there is uncertainty in the information. Well, I'm telling you right now that all of these types of distribution and habitat models, because as I pointed out earlier, they are models. They're wrong. We want them to be useful. They emphasize statistics, which means they may in fact not be well grounded in the biology. And sometimes you can get an answer itself that's an answer, but simply is not real. So what we deal with here in this decision risk concern and why we try to minimize this risk right here relates back to the defensible science here that all of us who are ecologists, well, certainly in my own USGS, as well as universities, NGOs, and other agencies with research scientists, we try to maximize the defensibility because there's a Supreme Court decision. Dauber Merrill Dow in '93, and you have to make sure that the techniques, our models right here, are recognized in the scientific community. That's usually defined by publications, focus of research, frequent usage, and be relevant and reliable to the issue, have application. And we just saw some of those applications right here. And there's some other curiosities down here, such as U.S. Fish Wildlife Service supported analyses. The federal case law presumes primacy of what the Fish Wildlife Service supports over this. But this is an incredibly important part when you're building these types of models. That is to make sure that as you build them, you are being as careful as you can so that you have a defensible product at the end. Now, there's even actually what is sometimes called the judicial Bible for scientific evidence. It's here, Reference Manual for Scientific Evidence. It's actually kind of a fun thing to look up. One of the more fascinating chapters in here, because it covers scientific evidence across the board, is on fingerprints. And I have to tell you, when I first was looking at this thing and I went in there and I read the fingerprint chapter, it was quite astonishing to read that. But this just shows you that we actually do, unfortunately, sometimes end up in litigious environments over these things, and we have to ensure that the science of these distribution and habitat models is defensible. There's also other reasons here. Sometimes these things to decision makers seem overly complicated. Pools of competing models. They lack common sense, data quality, quantity. There's this issue of potential versus habitat. And again, this is a fun book, How to Lie with Maps. I always loved this thing right here with Mr. Pinocchio's nose sticking out here like that. But if you want to find out more about map products, that's actually quite a fun book to read. But sometimes there's a host of these types of concerns because some people like to say that there has to be a best model. Well, let's look at Hurricane Dorian to defend this. You all tell me what's the best model here. This is what they call a spaghetti ensemble. Each one of these lines in here, and I think there's 40 some odd of them inside here like this, is a different weather-related model. Now, the problem we sometimes have is someone's going to pick this one and someone else is going to argue for this one. Now, the solution we apply is to create an ensemble of these things so that this bulb right here of all of these models translates into this with likelihoods of where are higher likelihoods. And now in the distribution world, for conservation and management, we do the same thing. Model 1, Model 2, 3, 4, and this can go on and on for all of these things. I call this my shark model because it kind of does look a little bit like a shark. But what I want you to focus on is notice inside here that all of these models are kind of focusing in this particular area. And so one of the ways we enhance defensibility is to take all of these models. And the cool thing about this is all of the stakeholders can build their own model, and we pool them together. And this is what we get. Notice that by the time we pooled all of that, we have darker the color, more models in agreement. Darker the color, higher likelihood. We can even deal with the error that's associated with this. So in one sense, by taking this type of approach, and remember, this goes all the way back to some of these people, Grinnell and Hutchison and Levin, and all of these people I mentioned earlier like this. We've just applied some of the cool techno tools we have nowadays to produce these types of things so that they can be properly used in a management and conservation environment. Because simply stated, no matter what, species distributions are central to management and conservation. And what we're trying to get away from right here, this is a dark kangaroo mouse. Now, currently in some map products, the fact that it has been found inside the state of Nevada indicates that from the Fish Wildlife Service perspective, if you're doing a management action down here, you have to survey. Whereas a more refined distribution, this came from NatureServe on up here, you can end up with a more efficient way to do some of the sampling efforts that you need. Here's another one, bull trout, and important. Now, when you look at this map, and to be fair to the Fish and Wildlife Service, they've recently updated this, but it's a good example to get my point across. Okay, I get this. This is dendritic over here. That's where streams are. So why is all of this being painted as the range map? Well, this is because inside here, and I'll just draw a couple of these, there's a whole bunch of little tiny watersheds. Just like all of these dendritic aspects up here are inside watersheds as well. Well, the map builders over here basically then just created a map that showed the streams, whereas over here, if the stream was inside the watershed, you can see precisely what they did. They just covered everything. It's not that this is wrong over here. It's just that this is more useful in terms of actually helping do the types of management. So we'll end with kind of one of my last questions here is how we address this decision risk by doing it. A lot of this is based on what we refer to as best practices. These types of things are how you analyze the distribution and habitat models, how you build them. And it's important to note that there's no way you can ever eliminate decision risk. All you're really striving to do is minimize it. I would argue there's more risk up here than there is over here for something. And there's ways we can deal with this. One of the more common things right now is to use our classic red light, green light, yellow light routine. And then you put a bunch of queries / issues over here, the presence data quality, background, evaluation. Now you can imagine this chart here stretches down and it does, there's like 40 or 50 categories inside here it does. And then you can define something as problematic, acceptable, or ideal. So as you build these models, you have a way of informing the decision makers whether or not how much faith they can place in the particular model that you're done here. So with that, kind of want to give some summary thoughts here. The concepts behind distributions and habitats associated with species, they're deeply rooted in our history of science. And it's kind of funny, it goes all the way back to Aristotle, who made some of these first recordings of this type of stuff. During our so-called Age of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries, there was this absolute explosion of interest in understanding how species evolved, explanations as to why they differ, as well as their relationships with the environment. From there came the niche, And then we began to apply statistical modeling, our geographic information systems. And then this has provided us a framework for building these types of map products that we use to address many of our pressing conservation and management issues. And so with that, I'll stop here because we're at the end of the discussion, and I'll turn it back on over to Mitch and Christy, and we can take any questions people might have.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Tom. Yeah, that was an excellent talk. I know for myself as a geographer, I really loved all the history in the beginning with the maps and all the species data that came after. And we did get a few questions here. So let me go ahead and pull these up. And just as a reminder for everyone, you can submit a question for Tom by clicking the Q&A button in the upper right of your screens. So Tom, the first one we have for you here will be from Anonymous. When you say species, are you talking about just birds, animals, or trees, all species, etc.?
These types of distributions have been used for non-vascular plants, vascular plants, fish, terrestrial mammals, birds, and even humans. So, you know, in some instances. So these types of models are completely independent of the particular taxonomic group that you're working with.
Okay, great. And the next one here, again from Anonymous, where would one find or download species data? Is there one source or agency that provides this type of data?
That's difficult. No, because the data sharing is a complex issue nowadays. I often refer to it as the siloing of data. But I would probably principally direct people to the Fish and Wildlife Services, Ecological Services, and what they call the ECOS, ECOS data site there. And you could probably find it by typing US Fish Wildlife Service, Ecological Services, ECOS, and that would take you there. That focuses principally on listed species, but there are some large, there's a plant one, I know, I don't have time to dig it up, but yeah, you could type in plant databases. There's a large one for plant data. There's a large one for movement of organisms. There's some private stuff out there, but there's also some information maintained by NGOs and states and universities that's a little bit more difficult to extract. It would be wonderful if more people made their information public, but there's a lot of what I euphemistically refer to as data siloing.
Right, gotcha. Okay. Another one here, I think this may have been covered. It came in earlier. Thank you for all this great information. Can these models be used to predict further future scenarios, taking things like climate change into account?
Correct. That example I showed of the aspen, that is indeed a what we call climate forecast model. Those are typically developed by taking the global circulation models that have been developed, the GCMs, and you have current weather or or climate variables. So you build the model and determine the relationships with the current. Then the future GCMs are spatial in their depiction. And so then you map where the niche of the species that it occupies today is likely to be located in the future. That's how we build these forecast models.
Got it. Okay, the next one, I actually let them know. They said, please define SDHM.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I let them know, hopefully this is correct, species distribution and habitat modeling.
Correct, yes, sorry.
Okay.
I'm guilty, like most ecologists, of living in acronym world, so.
Another one just came in. I heard that fractals are useful in modeling natural forms. Do you find them useful in your work?
Not now. Fractals were an area of great exploration in the 80s and 90s, but they're just not, I think their time in what I would define as the ecological literature has declined somewhat. Like most, I mean, the cool thing about science, ideas pop up, they get explored, and sometimes they get advanced, and sometimes they reside back into the background of history. And at least my experience and observation is the fractals is one of these that has kind of disappeared, at least in ecology. Certainly has a lot of importance in terms of crystals and electronics and things like that, but not so much in ecology.
Okay. Let's see. The last one I'm seeing here, I'll recheck in a second. It's just a comment. Fascinating talk. Thank you. Great pick to end the talk with.
Oh.
And it does look like, okay, here we go. Is it generally true that mobile species have a better chance at chasing their environmental distribution curves caused by climate change? Does this mean that plants and coral reefs have a tougher time than, say, birds?
Yes. However, the feedback, and birds in particular, there's a large array of literature that indicates birds are very adaptable in their ability. This is what Joseph Grinnell first discovered. You know, if you recall, I used the term mast for acorn. Well, there's 25 to 30 oak producing species if you go south of the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, and another half dozen to dozen in North America, Western North America. So unless the bird is highly specialized, just finding mast will work. Same thing with forest canopy. So they do have the ability to adjust a little bit, because it might not be as important as to say what particular tree provides the closed canopy that they nest underneath as it is for the closed canopy. Plants, yes, much tougher time. Their movement across landscapes is slow unless facilitated by humans. And that's one of the things the Forest Service I know is working very hard on, is to see whether or not, in anticipation of some of these changes, we can start moving some of these species forward. But absent, and they call that assisted migration is the phrase that is often applied to that concept. But you're right, if you're vagile, you can move. You have a higher likelihood of chasing these climate changes. If you're non-vagile, life could be tough.
Okay, two more just came in. The next question, so are you saying that species sightings are used to determine what factors affect species distribution? And then these factors are applied to other regions to predict where the species would then be found?
That is correct in both statements. Yes, we use their presence, and the statistical tools require an absent. So, you have to feed in a 1 for presence, 0 or something like that. And then you relate these to a bunch of hypothesized biotic and abiotic factors, precipitation, temperature, soil structures, things like that. That builds a model, then you apply that model in space and make a prediction.
Okay, it looks like this may be the last, from Paul. How does building models within a GIS itself, how does building models within a GIS itself, a set of models, affect the confidence of the results? And is there a standard method of bolstering the results? And go Aggies.
Oh. The GIS is not, it's an information system. It's not a model per se. We take the predictor variables themselves are often models. And so you're correct. We apply a statistical model to a set of GIS layers that themselves are based on models. Now there's two ways to assess this. One is you randomly permutate your data and you build a whole bunch of different types of models using subsets of your data. That gives you a measure of the error that is inside the sample that you have. The second way is to take the model out in the field and actually test it. So go back to those distributions that have high likelihoods, go sample there, moderate likelihoods, sample there. Most of the application nowadays is to set up efficient sampling schemes where the model is used to send boots on the ground, out there and try to make the monetary resources that are applied to do that, make that an efficient use. But yeah, that's basically, and that's part of the reason why I said earlier that there are legitimate concerns about these applications, and why I said at the beginning you should never use these models in a prescriptive sense as much as they are to help motivate an understanding and aid you in management and conservation decisions. They should never be used standalone.
Got it. And one more did come in. Should a model be validated by observation?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. You go out in the field and you would take that distribution map, which has all of those probabilities, and people typically bin them from 0 to 0.2, 0.2 to 0.4, et cetera, like this. And then you go sample in there and see if your model is predicting that you're finding in unsampled locations the thing you're searching for. But all of these things still require boots on the ground. I'm an old-fashioned enough person to argue that I can build the model in a heartbeat, but somebody's got to go out there and hike long distances and look for these things.
Right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now, Tom. So I think we'll go ahead and close the Q&A portion here. And obviously, thank you to you, Tom, for your talk tonight and for answering all these great questions that have come in. And also a huge thank you to everyone out there for tuning in. We do, just a reminder, we want to let you know about our lecture next month. We hope you'll come back and see us. I believe the flyer's up there now for you to see. And again, it's Zena Levy, research geologist. We'll talk about droughts and groundwater quality. And in case you either missed part of Tom's talk or just want to share it with others and watch it later, it will be available for on-demand viewing in about a week. We'll have it posted on our public lecture website, which is up on the screen now. It's www.usgs.gov/PLS. And as I mentioned in the beginning, if you did want to be a part of our distribution list, we send 2 emails a month, one in the beginning of the month to let you know what the lecture will be, and a reminder the week of. You can send us an email that's listed there. There's also a connect button on the website. And that public lecture website also has, 20 years of archived lectures. So there's about 180 there. Tom's will be added to the list. So yeah, we have a whole bunch of lectures on there for public viewing. So again, a huge thank you to Tom, huge thank you to everyone out there. And that's it for tonight. Everybody have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you for attending.